welcome to On Deadline. I'm Kendra Nichols.
I'm Dennis Owens.
And I'm Amanda St. Hilaire. Thank you for joining us.
If you're listening for the first time, we are journalists for ABC 27 News in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania.
But on this podcast, we talk about issues that affect people all over.
These are the conversations you don't hear on the news. We're different generations with different experiences, so we don't always agree.
But we do get very personal, get very real, and hopefully get you thinking. We are recording on September 25th, 2017, and today we're talking about thyroid diseases. According to the American Thyroid Association, an estimated 20 million Americans have some form of thyroid disease, and up to 60% of those with thyroid disease are unaware of their condition. So we're also going to talk about TMI, 3 Mile Island, and thyroid cancer in our area, of course, which is the Harrisburg area. One of the most intensely studied diseases following the TMI accident has been thyroid cancer, a new study coming out of Penn State. Well, here to help us understand the thyroid and discuss this new study, Dr. Rena DeArment. She is an endocrinologist with DeArment Endocrinology in Camp Hill. Thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm very happy to be here today.
So this is a personal issue for me because I deal with thyroid disease. You're actually my doctor. So let's just be upfront about that. That's why I wanted to bring her on.
Full disclosure.
Yeah, let's just be honest about that. So I think why I wanted to do this when I discussed it with you guys, I think, like they said, a lot of people have thyroid disease, don't know it. And for me, it was, what's wrong with me? Why am I always tired? Why am I getting, I was like, what is going on with me? So when I finally figured out what was going on, it gave me some kind of, relief. Okay, now I can try to fix it. So, is that true? Or are a lot of people out there suffering with this and not knowing it?
It's very true. A very typical consult for me in my office is that someone has finally gone to their primary care physician in urgent care and saying, I feel terrible, help me figure out why. And at that point, one of the screens that is done is the thyroid panel. And the patient is told that they have a thyroid problem, so to speak. And then the patient comes to my office and says, please explain these numbers to me. Why is this happening to me?
Maybe we should discuss what the thyroid is first.
Yes. I'm the least biological aware person in the building, perhaps in this region of the country.
Okay.
So what is it and what does it do?
Okay, the thyroid is an endocrine organ that lives at the base of the neck. Mm-hmm. It is essential for life. You cannot live without a thyroid gland. And without that hormone, eventually you would go into congestive heart failure, you would die. Other things that can happen to that thyroid gland are become overactive. The thyroid hormone is your metabolism hormone. So if you have too much of that, it's actually a bad thing. It's a stimulant. And again, if you have an overactive thyroid untreated, you would eventually die.
Now you said hormone. Is it a gland or a hormone or both?
The thyroid is a gland that makes a hormone.
Okay.
And hormones are chemicals which you have receptors all over the body for your hormones, and they allow them to function normally. If you don't have your hormone, then the body doesn't function properly. Another hormone is insulin. So one that you may be familiar with is juvenile diabetes.
Sure.
In those individuals, they've lost the cells that make insulin. If we don't give the insulin back, they would die. So thyroid is similar, just works on a different axis.
I was reading an article from Henry Ford Health System that called the thyroid a tiny misunderstood gland and said that managing a condition can almost be like tracking a moving target. So what makes it so difficult to track and what makes it so misunderstood?
The good thing about thyroid medicine at this point is we do have very accurate laboratory studies. All right. Whenever you come to me and we check those laboratory studies, we start out by looking at a hormone made by the brain that tells the thyroid what to do. All right. And that's called TSH. And that is the moving target that we're following along with the patient's symptoms. And the most commonly prescribed medication in this country is Synthroid or levothyroxine, which is thyroid hormone.
It's a mouthful.
It is. And that's the other number that one of the many other numbers that we can measure is how much Synthroid is in your body if we're replacing the hormone. Now, again, as I kind of briefly covered, there are many different thyroid states that you can have. The most common is an underactive thyroid. More common in women, more common as we age, and that's the hormone most commonly prescribed. So that's one of the first understandings that we need to get. What kind of thyroid disease do you have, and how are we going to follow the medication that we put you on?
What are some common symptoms that should make someone say, hey, maybe I should get checked out for a thyroid condition?
The most common being hypothyroidism. We call them soft symptoms because many things can cause them, but if you have thyroid disease, that is the cause of many of them. And they would be cold intolerance, waking, constipation, dry skin, difficulty thinking. If those things aren't functioning properly, it makes it very difficult to have a normal functional life.
tired and depression, does that weigh in too? Or
Yes.
fatigue, I guess?
Yes.
Yeah, I was reading
Yes.
about thyroid-related depression because I think sometimes we forget how much the physical affects the mental.
Correct. And, and it's that's where you often see it missed. Patients just assume that they're feeling fatigue because we're always burning the candle at both ends. They assume that they're feeling depressed and stressed because life is difficult, and they don't think to go have the biochemical test done. I would say locally there's I think providers are very good about doing the screen, but you have to get in the doctor's office to get that screen done.
And especially for women,
Yes.
for women with children.
Yes.
Moms, you put yourself last.
Correct.
And so you could be, and Kendra, I saw you nodding a lot during that whole thing.
Well, yeah, because I was going through all that and I was like, what's wrong with me? And it wasn't, I was in my third pregnancy and I just happened to say to the doctor, like, I'm nervous because, well, first of all, I was older. But and secondly, I had gained weight and I was like, and now I'm pregnant. And he was like, well, why are you gaining weight? I'm like, I don't know. I'm tired all the time. I get so tired that I feel like I can't wake up. Like there was just so much going on. And he's like, well, did you ever have tested for a thyroid? And I was like, what's that?
What's a thyroid?
But thank goodness, because that's how they caught it. And I don't know, can pregnancy trigger the thyroid
One of
conditions?
the most common times that I see women in my office is actually during pregnancy or after a pregnancy. What happens during pregnancy is that our immune systems are suppressed so that we don't reject the baby. And if you are predisposed to making antibodies to your thyroid gland, this is often a hereditary condition, our immune systems rebound postpartum. So it was probably babies number 1 and number 2 that wore out your thyroid by the time you got to baby number 3, and no one thought to look.
Right.
One more of the many gifts Mother Nature gives women.
Thank you.
But I do think, I mean, these are symptoms and things that can really affect relationships. So it's jarring to me that so many people are reportedly living with a thyroid condition and just aren't aware of it. Mm-hmm. That has a huge impact on your life.
Yeah. I mean, it's very common in midlife population. And unless you're busy having babies, we often don't go to the doctor. You just kind of blow it off, or you show up in urgent care for whatever acutely happens, and it's not routinely screened. And I think that's where it gets missed.
So what's the answer to fixing that part of the problem?
Awareness, doing more
This
podcasts,
podcast episode.
letting people know. One of the saddest, although with a good outcome, cases that I've seen was that it was a woman in her 30s, and she was a minister's wife. They lived in rural Pennsylvania, and they really didn't pursue routine health care. It wasn't their belief system. And this one, by the time that she finally pursued health care, it looked like she'd had a stroke. She'd had her babies, her thyroid gland had failed. She didn't pursue health care and follow-up, and everything completely slowed down. So she was to this point that she couldn't speak correctly. She couldn't think correctly. She was cold. She'd gained weight, and finally showed up at an ER somewhere. And my goodness, that TSH number that we talked about was off the charts. And it wasn't in her culture to pursue the health care. And 100 years ago, she would have died if we didn't have the thyroid hormone to give her.
Obviously, you're very passionate about this. What got you kind of into this field, saying, okay, this is what I want to focus on?
I was a biochemist to begin with, went to University Park, and decided not to work in the lab, wanted to work with people, so pursued medical school at Penn State, did internal medicine residency, and endocrinology is the biochemistry of medicine. So a couple of my loves all combined together. And it is a chronic disease. It's a lifelong condition, and I really enjoy the chronicity of care of my patients, because we do need to track that thyroid hormone. A requirement can change over time as other medications change, as we age, as the gland continues to fail. It's not a once and done. Once you have thyroid disease, it is tracked and treated for the rest of your life.
Are the symptoms different between, you were saying, the underactive versus the overactive? What's the difference, and how would that feel to an individual who has that?
As I said, thyroid hormone is the metabolism hormone. It's one of the ways you can think about it. So if you want to stimulate your metabolism, you use a stimulant. Caffeine, nicotine are some of the favorites. Thyroid hormone is another one. So you can imagine, for mild disease, I always correlate to being a little bit too much coffee that day, feeling kind of revved up. Jittery, heart racing, palpitations, anxious. Now you get to a pathologic level, you can have weight loss, you can lose muscle mass, you can have a cardiac arrhythmia. Again, untreated, hyperthyroidism is something that can kill a person.
Do they know what triggers it?
Typically, it's autoimmune disease, not the only cause. If I'm going to sit and explain to someone why they have a hyperactive thyroid gland, I'm going to explain that most common cause is the immune system. Because of genetics and environment, their body has started to recognize their thyroid gland as something foreign. The immune system in that situation can either turn the thyroid gland on consistently, making too much hormone. It can actually cause a destruction of the thyroid gland, where you initially pour out all that formed hormone, and then you become hypothyroid. It's kind of biphasic. And then the other cause that we haven't touched upon is this thyroid gland can also make lumps and bumps. You can have thyroid nodules, and they can either be inactive ones, it's simply a structural problem. An overactive one starts marching to the beat of its own drummer and making too much thyroid hormone, or you can have a thyroid cancer.
You talk about environment. Are there environmental triggers that people need to look out for, or is it something you can't really control?
Again, if we go back in time to, say, 120 years ago, it was actually iodine or lack thereof in the diet which caused thyroid disease. It's really fascinating. They've written books about it. So doctors often trained on the East Coast. They were at Hopkins, they were at Penn, and they would see some thyroid disease, but not the rate of it that they saw when they moved to the Midwest to practice. Out there, children, adults, even the dogs had goiters. So it took them a while to figure out why. And what it was is that you naturally have a fair amount of iodine in your diet when you're eating seafood, which you can get on the coast. You don't have it in the midsection of the country. So they had to figure out that iodine is what you need to form the thyroid hormone. Now, nowadays, the government actually does a very good job. They do these NHANES studies to make sure that we're getting adequate iodine. So our iodized salt that they use to make all of our products, for most people, they have adequate iodine. Now, people are having more alternative diets now, so that is something you need to watch for if you really have an elimination diet. But the thing that you can do if you're predisposed to thyroid disease, with the best of interest, if you take massive doses of iodine, that can be adding fuel to the fire if you're predisposed. That is something I tell my patients to watch out for. Again, another mineral, selenium, is used to make thyroid hormone. Again, you get plenty in your multivitamin. Again, with best of intentions, sometimes people can overdose on that and set off their thyroid gland. Otherwise, most prominently, it's just having other autoimmune diseases. We were speaking about juvenile diabetics. They often become hypothyroid because they're predisposed to making antibodies to their endocrine organs, pregnancy, or anything that sets off the immune system.
And you talk about this being a lifelong thing. So once there is a diagnosis, what kind of relief can people expect, and what can they expect to happen from there?
If you're diagnosed with hypothyroidism, we will put you on thyroid hormone, and hopefully, this can take months to a year till we titrate your medications. We get those numbers back to normal, and you continue to function normally, but it takes that pill a day to maintain those normal numbers. And those numbers can change over time. As I said, most patients I see at least once a year, often more often if they're not stable, so we can titrate that dose. If somebody has hyperthyroidism, we have mechanisms to treat that or follow that. But again, even if they go into a remission, they're always at risk for that happening again. So someone needs to follow those numbers and watch for the symptoms.
You mentioned it's mostly a woman's disease, so give me percentages. And men, I'm sure, do get it, but is it what are we talking?
Off the top of my head, I'm not going to give you percentages
roughly, because
I can't. But I would say that, anecdotally in my practice of my thyroid patients, I would say 60% women, 40% men. I have a specialty practice, so I often get the ones that are harder to treat. So it is certainly not uncommon in men. They're just a little less predisposed to the autoimmunity that women are. And also, I would have to say that there's probably men don't pursue healthcare like women do. So I bet the symptoms are blown off more than they are in women. And they're not pursuing fertility and other things that bring us to the doctor that men don't go for.
Men are too macho to go to the doctor sometimes.
Correct.
So let's review the symptoms again, just so people, in case they missed at the top, what should they be looking out for?
If there is fatigue, cold intolerance, skin dryness out of proportion than what you would expect for your activity level or your age, have a low threshold for asking the doctor to check the numbers. It is a very simple test to do, typically covered by insurance. Don't just blow it off.
Is there an age at which someone should absolutely have the numbers checked? Just run them, just do the test?
I would recommend any woman pursuing fertility, planning a baby, have her thyroid checked. Because we didn't mention the fact that in pregnancy, during the first trimester, the baby's dependent upon you for thyroid hormone. So if it's checked beforehand, you can make sure that baby has adequate thyroid hormone to form in that first trimester. For men, I would say by midlife for anybody who's having symptoms.
And what's midlife these days?
I'm going to call that 40s. How's that? That's about where I'm at, so I'll say in the middle.
And they can go to their general.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know, as a specialist, I get the more complicated cases or the patient more interested in receiving, more educated care. But the vast majority of this is recognized and treated at a primary care level.
And thyroid cancer, while a thyroid disease is not necessarily the only thyroid disease you're talking about. This isn't all cancer situations.
Correct. And actually, hypothyroidism and hyperthyroidism do not predispose you to thyroid cancer. Those are functional diseases as to what hormone the gland is making. Thyroid cancer is a structural problem with the gland. Often those people are euthyroid, which is the term for normal thyroid function.
This little gland is awfully complicated. Yeah. So let's start talking about thyroid cancer. You said it doesn't necessarily have to do. They can have fully functioning thyroids and develop thyroid cancer. Do we know why or what's happening?
We actually don't know what's happening. It's interesting because the rate of thyroid cancer is increasing worldwide and particularly in this area. So clearly there's something environmental that is changing that we have not put our finger on. Now the good news is that even though there is an increasing number of cancers, they are not more aggressive. It is not typical, not impossible, but it's not typical to die from thyroid cancer. It is a very treatable disease, but it is also a chronic disease. I have many patients in my practice. We're meeting at least once a year just to make sure that the thyroid cancer hasn't returned.
And is that found through a lump? Or is that through a blood test?
That is found through physical exam and visualization of the thyroid gland. There is no blood test that will identify a common thyroid cancer. Often picked up in the OB-GYN's office. They're very good in knowing about the relationship between thyroid disease and fertility. So they pick up a lump on the thyroid gland or in primary care doctor's office on your routine physical and say, hey, that feels kind of funny. And then they send you for the thyroid ultrasound. And that's where these lumps and bumps are discovered. Now, again, the vast majority of lumps and bumps on the thyroid gland are benign. That's what we call a goiter, an enlarged or lumpy thyroid gland. And we have our specialty organizations have tried to risk stratify what those nodules are because nodules are very common, particularly in women, also in men, and we can't be going and biopsying every little lump and bump that you find on thyroid ultrasound. So they characterize them by size, by their consistency on the ultrasound imaging, whether they have calcifications, and based upon what they see on the ultrasound, they make a recommendation whether or not the thyroid nodule should be biopsied. And biopsies are typically done, some by endocrinologists, some by ENT surgeons, often by radiology. If they find a nodule that's of interest, they can take a few passes with a hollow needle. Really no more noxious than getting your typical dental work. They do some topical anesthetic and they take a few passes with a needle. They can send that off to the pathologist and they can determine whether this is a nodule of concern or something benign that we can follow serially by ultrasound. Even benign things grow, so eventually we may recommend having it taken out because you don't want to be the big goiter on the one side of your neck. But that's how we differentiate whether these nodules are something benign or malignant.
Does heredity play any role?
Yes. And there is a slight predisposition to, if there's a family history of thyroid cancer, you're slightly more likely to have a thyroid cancer, and definitely with thyroid disease in general. And it expresses itself differently in different family members. So I often ask, is there any family history of thyroid disease? Who can we blame for these genes? And it's often like, well, my mom has a goiter, but she's not on medicine. My sister has an overactive thyroid gland, and mine doesn't work. So you get your own genes plus your genetics.
Yeah, I found out my grandmother had hers taken out after I discovered that I had one. I just didn't know. So
yeah, my mother had thyroid cancer, so I'm just wondering what that might mean.
Well, a little blip in your statistics.
Yeah.
You say thyroid cancer, and I think a lot of people right now think 3 Mile Island because of a study that came out earlier this year saying there's a possible correlation between the two. So can you take us through what that study actually says versus maybe what some people
the
think it's
headlines?
Right, because correlation and causation are different things.
Yeah,
Correct.
let me read a little bit. I told you that we wanted to read a little bit from that report. It's coming out of Penn State, just to kind of bring people up to speed. So this is from the report. On the morning of March 28, 1979, a series of unlikely events led to a partial core meltdown in the number 2 reactor of the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant, TMI. So since the TMI accident in 1979, the effect of the released radiation on the local population has remained controversial. This study represents the first effort to identify molecular signatures of radiation-induced thyroid cancer in the population surrounding TMI. So this study stands in contrast to several previous reports describing the radiation risks associated with the TMI accident. Government reports following the accident concluded that the radiation released during the accident posed little risk to human health. This study is saying otherwise. So when we read it, it's a lot of numbers and a lot of medical.
Right. And it sounds scary.
Yeah, it does. So help break that down for those of us who aren't in the medical field.
Yeah, I mean, and so I trained and practiced in this area my entire career, and it's always interesting when patients move back to the area and they've had a thyroid cancer diagnosed elsewhere, and it's known that they live here. It's always in big bold print in the letters I get. Oh, patient lived near TMI, and we really didn't know what to make of it all. Some of my colleagues had done some observational studies over the year, just kind of looking at, well, these are the patients we can pull from our, cancer. They keep a catalog of who gets cancer, and they could look at the numbers and say, well, it seems to be increasing, but it's increasing everywhere. Or they say, well, these are the pathologies that we're seeing that seem to be skewed sort of to this one type, but we really don't know what that means. What has happened over time is that, unfortunately, there have been other nuclear incidents such as Chernobyl. And they did a phenomenal job of tracking the individuals who were exposed to radiation after Chernobyl. There are nice maps of it. They know that when people are young and they're exposed to radiation, they are at greater risk of getting thyroid disease and thyroid cancer. And what they were able to do was track that, look at the pathology and the genetics of those patients who did have radiation exposure and related cancers. And now we can take what data exists from this area and compare it to that. So what was done at Penn State, whenever patients would have a thyroid removed for thyroid cancer, there are pathology slides created and stored. So they went back and they did a demographic search for all of the patients who would have been downwind, so to speak, of TMI. And they categorized those patients by those who developed thyroid cancer before it could have been correlated to radiation exposure. There is a window for when these things appear, or if they had thyroid cancer that appeared after that window of exposure. And then so they had 2 cohorts who were fairly evenly matched for age and geographic distribution and when they developed their thyroid cancer. And they looked at papillary thyroid cancer, which is known to be related to radiation exposure. And then they took those samples and then they did a molecular analysis on them. And we know that a common papillary thyroid cancer often has typical markers that we see. There's been a molecular change that has led to the papillary thyroid cancer. We also know that these cancers that were appearing after radiation exposure had other markers that appeared that weren't the same as those that were in sporadic papillary thyroid cancers. So they had their biochemist and molecular biologist work in the lab and do a comparison. Did these look like typical thyroid cancers, or did they look like radiation exposure thyroid cancers? And they did find that there was a signal there that those cancers that would have been in the window for after radiation exposure did look more like those Chernobyl thyroid cancers than those that were not related to radiation exposure.
So some of them seem to have that link. And what's this window you're talking about? Meaning you would have lived there at the time this happened and for the next couple of days,
no, the exposure time would have been, whatever that fallout period thereafter. But it takes a while for a cancer to grow, so there is a specific window.
But the point is they had to have lived in the area,
well, they had to live downwind, yes. So as we spoke, I lived upwind of this. I remember what happened. My family's not worried because we weren't downwind. So these patients they looked at the demographics, and they definitely would have been in what would have theoretically been the exposure area before they developed this cancer.
And what was that downwind exposure area?
As not the author of the study, I can't give you that demographic. So.
But the $1 million question is, some of those thyroid cancers may have happened anyway, right?
Correct.
So what are absolutely caused by, and I know nobody's going to go out on a limb and put a
Well, that's
specific
probably
number
why
on
they
it.
use the word
Right.
correlation
Right.
instead of
Right.
causation.
Right. And I think, but this is the first time, again, it's all been observational. I don't really know. This is the first time that there's been a study that truly showed markers of radiation exposure. We now have the knowledge in the database from other accidents to say, hey, this is kind of interesting.
Would
Again,
that have been Russian scientists that did that on the Chernobyl thing? Grabbing those people? Because that happened in Russia.
correct. And it's probably more World Health Organization. They're international organizations of endocrinologists and surgeons who, try to jump in. It was an unfortunate but a phenomenal research experiment that was done. So
Now, I know with this particular study, my understanding it was just patients who were getting treated for thyroid cancer at Penn State Hershey Medical Center.
Correct.
So it sounds like the next step is kind of that larger pool of patients.
which would almost be impossible to get, because we don't have a nationalized healthcare system. People come to and fro, They tried to track down who was in that area. There is a list of people, but as I said, patients move to California, they get diagnosed, their pathology is somewhere else. I don't know that any organization has the power or the funds to collect all those people and look at it.
How worried should people be about this?
Actually, the window for the development of the radiation-related thyroid cancer is over. If you were going to get it, that's been done. So again, if
It was
you
like
live
38 years ago.
Right.
Yeah.
Was the
the
accident.
window, well, the
Right, the
accident,
accident was 30
right.
years ago.
Cancer could
if
develop
the
years
cancer was
later.
going to develop, it would have developed by now. I think their cutoff was saying anything developed after mid-90s would not have been radiation related. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't people sitting out there who were downwind, who never went to their doctor and had their neck palpated. They may have a cancer related to that. But if you've already been checked out and you were fine post mid-90s,
But will
You're
that show
okay.
up with this marker we're talking about? So, I mean, even if you live in California now,
oh, sure.
that type
sure.
of cancer would have that marking on
right.
it. That's
If you,
the kind of a telltale sign.
Yes, but no one is going to go looking for that unless you're in a research
Right,
study. This
right.
is not a standard marker that we use.
So it's no way of knowing how many people were affected.
Yeah,
or
and
could
my
have been.
bigger concern is if you have the government saying it's fine,
Yeah, the fact
everything's
is
good,
there were some that were.
and now
for
we're
sure.
saying, well, maybe it wasn't fine. That's my concern.
Right. So, and to argue in the government's defense, they didn't really know. They didn't have the data then. So,
Of course, they didn't actively go look for the data
Right.
either, or try to collect it. Better that way. So now I lived for a number of years within that circle of whatever that circle is they have around 3 Mile Island. That they give you iodine pills or something like that. You're supposed to update them. I think they still do that actively.
yes.
Is that at all a safeguard?
It does help, actually. So what happens is that when you have a nuclear accident, it affects the iodine in the atmosphere. As we discussed, iodine is what thyroid hormone is made out. So if you flood the thyroid gland with normal iodine, then you don't have that exposure risk. So it doesn't protect the rest of your organs, but it does protect your thyroid.
What is it about radiation that seems to target the thyroid? Like, why are we talking about thyroid cancer with this instead of, an increase in breast cancer, an increase in other cancers? Is it because of that
It's because
iodine
of the
factor?
iodine, and the thyroid gland collects iodine, and then it sits there, and you make all this preformed hormone, and it gives that radiation time to adversely affect the genetics of the cells. So whereas the other radiation is cleared by the body in other ways, takes higher doses to create a problem.
Interesting. What was the reaction from your community, like from the endocrinology community, to this study? Were a lot of people talking about it, or is it what they expected?
I think there was some fascination. Clinically, it doesn't change much that we do. I think as an endocrinologist, you always have a pretty low threshold for going to look for lumps and bumps and cancers because we see them so often. But I did think it was a very well done study, because what you do wonder about it. And I work closely with all the other docs in the area, and you're like, well, it's another weird thyroid cancer. You just don't know,
And there's no indication, you said it is going up in this area, but we really just don't know why, other than we believe it might be environmental.
Correct. And that's a worldwide phenomenon. And it's not all, we do have wonderful technology now. It's very easy to ultrasound something. So they did do a nice study in Korea where they decided to look at everybody's thyroid, and then they decided that was a bad idea because they were finding a lot of incidental thyroid cancers that probably never would have evolved to anything. So they were looking a little bit too hard. So that was just a bias of looking too closely. But even when you eliminate that, there still is a rise in thyroid
Well, that's
cancers.
something that always bleeps on me. Is it really going up, or are we just better at seeing it? Are we better at detecting it? And are more
Yes
people
and yes.
going in and
Yes, and yes,
you know,
yes, and yes.
If you live in Korea, your problem was that everybody was looking too hard. A little less so in this country. Like I said, when they eliminate for that, we're still finding more of it even when you're not aggressively searching.
And now you know. Who knew the thyroid had so much going on? All right, thank you so much for
you're
being
welcome.
here with us today and helping educate us. Again, Dr. Rena DeArment, endocrinologist from Camp Hill. We appreciate your time.
You're very welcome.
Now it's time for a word from you, your thoughts, comments, questions, suggestions you sent us this week. We did get an audio recording, a voice memo, so let's play that.
Hi, my name's Mackenzie, and I live in Rockville, Maryland, but I grew up in Mechanicsburg. I have a question about the last podcast that featured the baby boomer generation. Reading some of the comments on this particular podcast, I noticed a lot of argumentative and upset people who self-identified as baby boomers. However, a lot of these people didn't even take the time to listen to the podcast. What do you guys think about that?
Amen, sister.
well, that's
Kendra's favorite,
anybody
the
that listens to
headline
this
readers.
podcast knows that is a source of pain. Yeah. Look, the bottom line is, if you want to have an opinion, you got to listen before you have an opinion, and then you can have an opinion.
Yeah.
So one of the comments that I actually pulled up for a word from you involves that. I would like to say, as the resident millennial, that I find it entertaining when millennials get called lazy and then people are commenting on something without listening to it. There also seem to be a lot of hurt feelings. And for those of you who maybe didn't catch that episode of the podcast yet, it's about Pennsylvania's pension crisis.
Right.
But the conversation kind of evolved into a discussion of baby boomers are paying into this system now in a way that is not sustainable. So millennials are going to be the ones who get hit twice as hard.
But hang on, I just want to say one thing. I'm a baby boomer,
Yes.
and I'm paying in and getting no benefit too. So
Correct.
it's not just millennials.
You're paying in right now, but
Have been my whole life.
You are.
Yeah, and we were clear. People that are state workers and teachers have also paid in their
Correct.
fair share.
You've paid in. In 20 years, when this thing goes bottom up and pensions are an even bigger portion of our budget,
Right.
and more services get cut, and perhaps taxes have to go up even more, the people handling the brunt of that are going to be the millennials with families. And that was the overall
Right.
point of that. So
And-
it's not saying baby boomers aren't paying into it,
Right.
but also it's saying that for the most part, the lawmakers who helped push this through and create this situation, they
while
themselves
protecting
are
their
baby
own
boomers.
pensions. But see,
Correct.
at least they have a vested interest and they're going to get a pension. There's
Correct.
lots of baby boomers like myself who have paid in a lot of money through our
There are.
careers and aren't getting any. We're
There
not getting
are.
pensions.
So
So just to be clear, so when you say baby boomers, that's not just
yes,
Yeah.
But listen, so we talk about the generational differences a lot, and maybe just. As a millennial, I'm used to hearing broad criticism about my generation, right? And we have a whole podcast episode on this. And so, okay, you might get some reaction to that. The second you give the same kind of broad generational criticism to baby boomers, Facebook and Twitter lights up.
Well, and we
so
should be-
who's the sensitive one
we
now?
should be clear that the people that were making the point are both baby boomers.
Yes,
one's a
I was the
retiree
only
and a
millennial in
pensioner.
the room.
Correct, and he's the one who said we're the greediest generation. It wasn't you that said that. Talking
Correct.
about baby boomers.
Yes. No, I know better than to
Yeah.
say that. But the whole idea also is that in Pennsylvania, we were talking about how we do, or rather, do not tax the elderly. And
Right.
so...
And that's the other part
And
of
I
it, right.
wonder how much that will be sustained when my generation is elderly, if that even will be able to be sustained.
Right.
But we do hit the family with the two kids.
Correct, and I thought and this is what, in my opinion, the media hasn't been on enough, or at least the marketing campaign hasn't been on enough, that this state, which doesn't tax pensions, steers its lottery proceeds towards senior citizens. There are a number of senior citizens having retirement income, so they're retired, in theory, houses paid off, not buying as much stuff, getting $80,000, $90,000, $100,000 and pay no taxes on that. While the guy who's making $40,000, young guy making $40,000 a year trying to raise a family, is getting nailed on taxes. And it was
Right.
just his point, not my
Right.
point, but his point. That's not really a fair system.
Now the person, who is elderly and retired will argue, well, I already put my time in when I was younger, so now this is the reward I will reap.
Right.
But that young guy who's making $40,000 a year with 2 kids likely will not get to reap that same reward.
No.
And that was kind of what the discussion was centered around.
Oh, exactly.
Right. But I think my generation, we're used to getting overall criticism. I mean, there is training in workplaces right now for how to handle millennial employees. Baby boomers are getting trained for how to handle millennials. So we're used to that broad-based criticism. The second you do it for a baby boomer, it's like,
but here's
who's
the
the
thing.
sensitive one now?
You're younger. Respect your elders.
Exactly. I agree with that.
Listen, Dennis.
Listen, Gen X is
Well, it's funny.
I know. Kendra's sitting over here like, hey, I don't got either one of those problems.
So my brother, who is a retiree and happened to listen to that podcast with me, it was funny hearing his reaction to a couple of things you said, a couple of things they said. It was fun. And he's also a pensioner. He was a 33-year career teacher in Philadelphia, and God bless him. But when I brought up, I said, at one point he said, what is the tax in Pennsylvania? He said 3.07%. He goes, oh, well, what's the big deal about that? So meaning, if you were to tax the pensions at 3.07%, I don't know that there's hordes of people leaving the state because they got to pay 3.07, but at the same time, that would raise, I think Barry said, between $2 and $3 billion.
But the issue is, lawmakers, I don't think, are as concerned with people leaving the state as they are people voting for them.
Well, that's correct.
Right. Well, yeah, that's their major concern.
and we have a large elderly population that votes in Pennsylvania, and the second you say you're going to put a tax on that, you are putting yourself at risk, no matter how big or how small that tax is. But I just found it entertaining. There was one comment where someone on Facebook said something. I'll read it. Another stupid article, ABC 27, you should be ashamed of yourselves.
First of all, it's not an article, it's a podcast. Go ahead.
Without boomers, the entitled, whiny millennials wouldn't be here, and I highly doubt they are paying for boomers. So I try to not respond to these, but I couldn't resist for this one. And I said, I introduced myself. I said, hello.
Don't stop her. She's on a roll.
And I said, did you listen to the episode or did you just read the headline and comment? As a general rule, I find it's a good idea to listen to the content before complaining about it. I'm already a millennial, so jumping to conclusions without having all the information might make me come across as entitled and whiny winky face.
He was like,
He responded and said, I don't waste time reading this. If you say what you want about me not reading at all, but when you start reporting the truth, I'll start reading it.
But he wouldn't know because he's not listening.
Well, the problem is there was a lot of great truths in that show, and people need to hear it.
But the general idea, whether you're gonna listen or not, is we can't have these conversations if we're not listening.
There's no point in having a conversation.
Right. So we can sit here and joke about the different generations, and Dennis, I'll get you back later for saying I should respect my elders. But we can leave here with the great thing about this podcast is with different perspectives.
And learn something.
Exactly. Shocker, intelligent people can disagree and actually are probably all better for it.
Right.
So I hope that's kind of the message people walk away with. But to end it on kind of a happy note, I do want to read a new review we got in Apple Podcasts. We're always plugging that you should go review us because it actually helps us bring the podcast to more people. But exec Glenn wrote, the listener gains a unique perspective into their thoughts and opinions far beyond what would be exposed in the confines of a newscast. Each co-host brings their own unique perspective to the table. So yes, it gets personal. That's what makes it unique. So thank you, Exec Glenn, for the kind words. And if you feel so compelled,
is Exec Glenn
good, bad, ugly,
to any of us?
No, I don't think so. I don't know who that is. So thumbs up. But if you feel so compelled, whatever rating, give us an honest rating, an honest review, because that does help us out.
Yep.
But only if you listen.
Only if you listen. There should be a test. You only get to review if you listen to at least one episode all the way through. Yeah, there was something about a social media filter that was going to prevent people from commenting or sharing on articles unless they had read at least 2/3 of it or something like that.
I'm all for that.
Yeah, let's get on that.
All right, we got to wrap this up. If you'd like to check out the links to the stories, articles, and videos we discussed, you can find them in our show notes on our website, abc27.com. To get On Deadline delivered directly to your phone, tablet, or computer each week, subscribe in iTunes or Google Play Music. Record your thoughts, questions, and suggestions about episodes and voice memos on your phone and email them to us. That's at theinvestigators@abc27.com. And please take a few minutes and leave us a review in iTunes. It helps our podcast reach other people and helps us figure out what we can improve and gets Amanda fired up. Thank you, Eric Semmel, for producing this podcast. Jason Dietz for composing and recording the music, that is. It's time for us to go. We're on deadline.